The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. As I said elsewhere on a different podcast, we're your book group that just waits patiently in your podcast feed until you decide to join us. Joining you as always is me, Greg, who's doing this intro, but halfway through it realized I think I did the last intro. And joining me, the guy who just shirked his duties on the intro, Tylor.
That is absolutely correct. You said it was your turn, and I didn't even think critically about it at all. Welcome, everyone. I hope you will, excuse the break in decorum. We're probably going to lose about half of our listeners because you did two intros in a row. They just can't handle that.
No.
We both just spent a bunch of time with one another at Rhode Island Comic-Con. It was a wonderful time, but as a result, I'm kind of done talking with you about anything other than the Wheel of Time. So I suggest we dive straight in to yet another ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast. Greg, why don't you talk us through what this image looks like and your initial thoughts on it before I dive into what it's used for and any other symbology?
I'll one-up you, and first I'll tell people what the image is before I start to describe it.
Good decision.
All right, we are going to talk today about the opening of Chapter 42, which has two images on it. I mean, they're not identical, but they're essentially the same thing. And it is two pictures two pictures of each of one raven. So for those doing the math at home, that's two total ravens.
We are having a rough go today, and I like it.
And some people would stop here and just start it all over, but we're just gonna
not us
on through. So we are here looking at Chapter 42. And when you pointed me this way, just prior to turning on the microphones, I said, "Oh," because it reminded me, of course, that we have seen this a very, very long time ago, as I recall. Would this be on the prologue chapter?
Yes, I believe it was on. No. Oh, I don't have that chapter in my book.
It is. It is on earlier, which I believe is the chapter added way later than the rest of the book. So
that is correct. I actually thought you were going to note there is another chapter. It's chapter 4 or 5. When we first meet Moraine and Lan, she throws a stone at some ravens. This is also the chapter icon on that chapter.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And that was long before we started this subsection of the podcast. So looking at these wonderful ravens now, we talked last week about how the lion had a frame break, and both of these ravens do as well here. But perhaps what's more notable is we have basically as black an image as you could get. It is a black background with a black border with a black raven on it, all done with the thinnest of white outlines. But the two largest pieces of white are the eyes on each raven. So to me, this is saying a few things. It is saying this is just darkness. This is the power of the dark side here. And, we haven't read too much into the frame breaks because a lot of them do, but it does start to feel in this chapter like the darkness is pushing outwards. It's escaping its original bounds and what's been holding it back. And so it feels fitting that we have these two ravens who are kind of mimicking that. And then the last thought I would give before passing it off to you is the white eyes. striking and larger than they should be on a raven. And part of that is just a reminder that they're always watching, right? And we have a good reminder here about you're not safe in your dreams. There is a reminder about how you're not safe when you're dead. And we learned in the chapter before this last week that basically the darkness has been watching the dagger the whole time. And, so it's just a reminder of the ever-present nature of that vigilance.
One very minor correction about the thing that you just said at the very, very end. It's worth noting we know that the dark has been drawn to the dagger, but it hasn't been able to watch it. In fact, the force that it was taking over Matt, remember, was driven by a hatred for the darkness. So it's yet another weird thing of gray, which is very unlike what we're faced with in this image. You're exactly right. I think the key feature of the Raven's image is just how dark it is. And I think the thing that was interesting is you described the eyes as having a really thick white outline, and I think that's accurate. It's the thickest white line that we have in the entire image, but I think it's also notable just how large the pupil is there, and I think that that really kind of gets at the imagery and kind of the metaphor that you were drawing when you were talking about the image, right? Our attention is drawn to the eye, and specifically we know that ravens, like rats, are kind of spies for the Dark One, and so the idea that the Dark One is watching kind of in this symbol, I think, is really well done, right? It highlights exactly what we need to get out of the image. Unsurprisingly, this image at the beginning of a chapter can either mean that there will be ravens in the chapter. That does happen literally sometimes. Like, I believe this was also the image, possibly in one of the chapters where they were running away from the ravens with the wolves and Elias. In the chapter. I'd actually need to go back and double check that. It might just be the evil things image. But the other thing that shows up when we see this chapter icon is the shadow in more subtle ways than some of the other icons we've seen before. We had, for example, the Trolloc icon that we discussed, which normally shows up when there are, shadow spawn arriving and, people are going to be destroyed in some sort of battle. The image of the raven means kind of the same level of darkness or evil bubbling up in the chapter, but it's more likely to be subtle. This is more likely for dark friends or for a spy who's in the light rather than a direct overt confrontation. So I like that we get kind of multiple symbols for the dark, given how dark it seems like the series is going to get. And this seems like a really apt one for that side of what the evil is doing. So I kind of want to leave you with last thoughts on this image now that I've kind of gone through everything I have to say about ravens in general. And just as I say that, Greg turns away. So let me also just say, I really like this image because it's kind of the diptych. And the one thing that I will say is that the two ravens really, I think what I'm trying to get at is the poses that they have. Both of them look really unnatural in some way. And I think that also kind of heightens the way that the Dark One is kind of brought into this image. And now Greg is looking at me and can possibly give me final thoughts on the image. I'm not good at podcasting.
Sorry about that. We had ironic given the conversation we're having. We had a nightlight emergency where my son's nightlight, his light bulb was out, and my wife desperately came down to say, "Hey, where are the light bulbs for this? Because he really wants his light." And while that is just awesome happenstance, I'll also note, we're talking also immediately after the time change, and so this theme of like just darkness is everywhere in our lives right now, and there's this nice synchronicity. My son is desperate for a light bulb because it's been dark for 4 hours at 8:13 as we're talking, and it's just that time of year, and it's nice that we're syncing up there with that. So final thoughts on these. I really like what you said about this is the insidious darkness, the darkness that isn't a direct confrontation, and as a symbol of that, the raven is good because ravens are all around, right? Like it's a plain symbol, but if like you said, rats, ravens, those are all servants of the darkness. So it's nice that that's both a common sight, but also one that should really unnerve our heroes. Although us in real life, we're probably safe.
I don't know what you're talking about. The bird scarred me as a child. I do not like crows and ravens. Why don't we actually then just dive straight in? Chapter 42, Remembrance of Dreams. And this chapter kind of begins with everyone walking away from Moraine's declaration about just how sick Matt is, and everyone kind of being stunned, and then immediately being stunned for a completely different reason, as they see Loyal for the first time, and no one really knows how to react except for Rand, of course. They have a brief discussion about the steading. We get a little bit more information about Loyal, and we learn that he's actually been out of the steading for 3 years, even though he considers it relatively recent that he has left. At this point, however, we get an immediate change in that Matt walks himself down from the room and immediately starts apologizing. It becomes clear that Moraine is watching him closely and doesn't completely trust everything about what's going on, and it soon becomes apparent that Matt still has the dagger with him. Moraine says that she doesn't have the power to remove the curse entirely, given how long it's been with him, but she was able to contain it. It should keep things basically limited for the time until they can get to Tar Valon, and her sisters find some way to actually kind of remove whatever it is that this dagger is doing to Matt. After they have that discussion, Loyal starts to ask a question after Rand kind of blathers about what happened to him in the palace. It spurs Loyal to ask a question of Moraine. And basically, he tells a story very similar to what we heard Perrin hear from the Tinkers about a number of Aiel who came to a steading who were injured, and before they left, they told the story about the Eye of the World and the Great Serpent, and how the Dark One intended to kill the serpent or do damage to the eye. And that prompts Perrin to respond saying that he heard the same thing with the Tinkers, and then it prompts Perrin, Rand, and Matt to all admit that they have heard Baal-Zaman talk about the Eye of the World. Moraine basically, first off, is clearly upset that they haven't told her about her dreams, but actually takes it shockingly well. The boys don't, seem to get any real flack for not telling her. And then she basically says, well, if all of the signs are pointing us in this direction and we have someone who can take us through the ways, it's obvious what we need to do. We need to go to the Eye of the World, and Loyal, you're going to take us there through the ways. To which Loyal says, oh no, if we do that, we'll die. And we learn more about it in the next chapter. But for now, I'd love to hear your take on this chapter, which is the first of what I think are 2 chapters this week that are kind of a little bit of lore drops in a lot of ways. So there's lots of things to pick out, and I'm curious what stood out to you.
Agreed that this, maybe I'll just say it was quite unexpected, right? Because we ended last chapter and it's like, it's going to be a real battle to save Matt. And then the biggest surprise of the chapter being just like, hey guys, what's up?
Yep.
And, it is striking to me that he has forgotten a lot. He was kind of behind a cloud that made it so he remembers very little. I believe he says after Whitebridge, right? Like he remembers Tom's sacrifice, and then it's all kind of darkness to him, which matches his kind of increasing grumpiness as we moved across those chapters. So I think that's my biggest surprise. Among the lore dump, this is by far not the most important, but something I really enjoyed is Loyal says in giving his backstory that he's motivated by stories, just like Tinkers are motivated by songs. And we know Moraine was motivated to collect stories, and we know Tom was a storyteller. And there's some nice resonance where basically everybody who is joining up and joining the light is not doing so to have a story, but it are people who love stories. And, obviously reading a giant fantasy book series, that's just nice because you're like, oh, they're like me. I could be on their team too. So I just liked that resonance as a small moment I picked out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to me, in that kind of initial conversation, both kind of before Matt arrives and we get that first kind of lore dump of Loyal's backstory, one thing that really struck me in that conversation is how it started, which is Perrin is actually the first one to speak up after everyone is stunned. And the question that Perrin asks is basically, is it true that steading are places of peace? And I thought that was a really telling moment for where Perrin is at as a character, because we haven't been in his head really really since the night that he got out of captivity from the White Cloaks. So he's had a lot of time to think that we really haven't been privy to. And so the fact that he's dwelling on peacefulness and steadings, which obviously is where he killed 2 White Cloaks, is a really interesting place for this conversation to start. And then the fact that we get, kind of the Loyal story coming out of it, I think is a really interesting development from that.
Definitely. And I will say steading as a word kind of jumped out as me in that category of like, oh, I should remember what that is. And I didn't. So I appreciate both in your summary and there where you're filling in a little more detail than that. And it's funny in concert with Matt's return, it's now like, well, Perrin is the one I'm worried about now because Matt seems to be recovered. And while I don't think Perrin was ever in as much danger as Matt, it's now like, okay, we fixed one problem, but we still have this wolfiness to deal with.
Yeah, and I think it's actually in this chapter that we see Moraine is saying when they're talking about their dreams, she says, I can protect you. Being near me is going to be really valuable in that regard. And then Perrin's immediate response is, I think I've already found my protection, right? And so it's very clear that while there is still, something odd going on with Perrin, he's at least beginning to accept that about himself. Yet another development we've had that we hadn't really seen the last time we were in his head.
And I'll use that as a transition to the dream. So definitely the coolest part of the chapter there is this kind of reckoning on the part of Moraine, or recognizing, I should say, where she sees like, oh, all the pieces are coming together, that you would all find this same message in all these kind of assorted locations. And I really liked that. And it's funny because it felt like the kind of thing that should feel too clever by half. It's like he sprinkled it in, and then he's like, did you catch that these were all sprinkled in around here? Did you see all these resonances? And I do think part of me should be like, well, yeah, because you said them all. And I certainly remembered the language, but I don't know that I had all the pieces at once. So, speaking to you, I imagine this is something that's rewarding on the reread, that you can pick out these details as you go across and see them come together.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that really works well about this book. And one of the things that I will talk about once we're kind of like reviewing the book in general is often the Eye of the World. I feel like the first time you read it is really fun. The second time you read it is the best, right? This is a book that is all about kind of laying groundwork. After that, I'll be honest, I think there are diminishing returns once you've kind of caught all of the hints of later things. But I think the really interesting thing to me about this kind of discussion around all of the pieces coming together is how Robert Jordan has, we kind of discussed this a little bit earlier in a previous episode, he's given himself too clever by half insurance, right? That's what ta'veren is. He's allowed to drop hints in 8 different ways, and it doesn't feel like a plot hole or doesn't feel like something, is happening that doesn't fit the reality of the world. The reality of the world is bent around these boys. And I think that that's, a fun thing that he gets to play with over and over again. And we've seen it a couple times now.
Yeah. And I think the chase 2 episodes ago of the beggar chasing him and putting him in the court, that was to me, okay, now I understand what ta'veren looks like. And this is like a whole other dimension of this, right? That like now it's not just in the immediate moment you could be pushed a certain way, but that there are larger fragments coming together, and all the metaphors are there, right? They are strands being woven together. They are strands of a web, right? All of that is again very clear, and I think you're right. It's really nice that his mythology has that space for it, and I don't even feel like he's pulling a fast one, right? Like I think you're right. It you could view it very cynically, but it feels earned because that is such an intricate part of how this weaving is happening.
Yeah, and I think we see this a couple of times in this chapter where Moraine is immediately kind of stunned by a piece of news and then seems to accept it almost as just like, okay, ridiculous things are going to happen around these boys. And this actually brings me to something that I wanted to mention, because in this chapter towards the end, Loyal declares, after kind of spending some time around the whole group, that all 3 of the boys are ta'veren, right? He knew Rand was before, and now after having spent spent a bit of time with all of them and hearing their stories. He believes that all three are. And that, I think, is an interesting revelation. We get confirmation of that, even though we had suspicions earlier. But I think it's actually Moraine's reaction to that that is more surprising, because Moraine responds by saying, yes, there are three of them. It's amazing. I was only expecting to find one. And that is not a thing we knew that she was expecting to find. She had never mentioned wanting to find anything other than stories at this point. So I was curious, both in terms of how you thought about this, final declaration that all of the boys are ta'veren, but also whether you caught and what you think about that kind of nugget of Moraine and something about her motivation we really hadn't seen before.
I don't think I was smart enough to have caught that she hadn't revealed that, because I think it just felt so natural at this point. Like, we've built up to it by so much. It's like, I wasn't a surprise. It's like, you're a wizard, Harry. It's like, yeah, we know. Like that. Yeah, it's been obvious by now. So I think at that level kind of escaped me. But I will tell you, in that moment, I actually thought most about Egwene, and how she is going to continue on in this adventure. They make clear, I forget in which of these two chapters. But then it was like, you three are the most special people in the world, and here's your friend. And so I know you pointed out before that Robert Jordan's book struggles a little bit with being of its time, and while it might make some strides towards a feminist fantasy, it's certainly not there yet. And thinking about why it is that we're going to make it so obvious that she is a lesser class in this regard, or, a lesser part of this story. That's honestly where my mind was primarily when I was reading it. I was like, come on, she's cool too.
Yeah, and I will say this is something that I've always struggled with. I think I've mentioned Egwene is one of my favorite characters, right? I have like 3 or 4 characters in this series who are the bedrock for me, and she is one of them. And so I've always kind of in my head been almost of two minds, and I can never really decide which I am. There's a part of me that firmly believes my headcanon that she is also ta'veren, and people are just too dumb to notice it. That is contrasted with the part of my brain that wants to say, actually, Egwene is obviously going to be an important character in this story to one degree or another. I don't want to spoil anything, but the fact that she achieves whatever she does not being ta'veren makes her a way better character than those three who have all of the plot hole armor. So I am willing to accept either of those two arguments. What I'm not willing to accept is Egwene sucks, which I know a bunch of the internet believes, but no, they're wrong.
Am I right in remembering that you said the television show kind of nudges her up a little bit? Does it deem her ta'veren, or has it not tipped its hand that much?
I don't believe that. Actually, I forget whether she is ta'veren or not on the television show. I think she might be. The big thing that is the major difference in the show. The show is a little bit more explicit up front about what exactly Moraine's goals are. She's more of the character who gets the main viewpoint of the show, but the other thing that's definitely different is that rather than Moraine having kind of 3 candidates for whoever she was searching for, she has 4, including Egwene. And so regardless of whether she's ta'veren, she is at least kind of potentially the one.
And then I guess a related point to me, and my last thought on the chapter is, and you've alluded to this already, is Moraine's just kind of in a go with the flow mood all of a sudden. And it's like, okay, you broke my instructions, but that's okay. And it really felt, all of whatever choices happened got them to this moment here with this group of people. And I think Moraine is accepting everything that led to that moment, right? Yeah. Like, this is silly, but that's how I've always felt. I'm happily married, love my family. And it was like the moment I had my son, I was like, oh, all of my choices made sense, because I was supposed to be here having my son. I also have a daughter later. But it was like, oh, that's like, now when I look back and I'm like, should I have talked to that person that time? I'm like, no, I had to get here to this point, with my wife and to have my son. And that's like, I'm not going to say it was my destiny or something like that, but it's like, I'm very accepting of all the paths not taken when you have this goal in mind. And, while that may be a little far afield, I feel like that's kind of where Moraine's head is at. It's like, okay, we have a good chance now, and we have all these extra tools and paths and options. So I'm just going to accept all of this behind us and look forward, because there's a higher power at work.
Yeah, and I think Moraine is definitely a character who is she is a planner. We have seen that. She always seems to have contingencies and is thinking through what's the ideal plan, what's plan B, how do I deal with it? And she's also just someone who is ridiculously competent, right? And so to see someone who seems to be kind of that like type A in charge drive just say like, okay, what's done is done, I can't do anything about it, I think is not what's typical of that character, right? We're clearly seeing something that breaks that archetype to some degree. A lot of times the characters who act like that are the ones who can't accept failure or are hard on themselves. But also I think what we're seeing is a character who is just really mature compared to everyone else who we're seeing, right? In the field of like 18-year-olds that we are seeing among these boys, it's really nice to have a character who understands that like people make mistakes and we don't hold them against them if we can't change anything about it. That's kind of magical.
I mean, that's what I hope to be in my classroom of college freshmen on a near daily basis. Yeah, and maybe that's it. It's really in contrast to what's around her, and it just feels like maturity or magic in some way, but it's just experience.
Yeah, and I think you said that was kind of the last thing you wanted to talk about in this chapter. I have one last little thing that I want to note, just because it's the kind of thing that's exceptionally easy to miss on like first, second, third, fourth reads. And so it's worth noting just now rather than later, because, hey, that's why you listen to podcasts like this. Fun little details. In my book, it's on page 594, if you happen to have the trade paperback edition. But when Moraine is talking about the dreams and the Dark One being able to touch the dreams of the boys, she says, remember the stories of the Forsaken binding men to them, strong men who had fought for the Dark One from the start. Those stories are true, and none of the Forsaken had a tenth of the strength of their master. Not Agenor or Lanfear, not Belthamel or Demandred, not even Ishamael, the betrayer of hope himself. A, that's rad. B, we've heard mention of the Forsaken a few times before. We've gotten one or two names dropped. This is the first time I think we've gotten more than 2 or 3 at a time, right? I think we've got 5 or 6 Forsaken named in this. And so it's worth kind of keeping an eye on those names. Those are clearly things that are being brought up over and over again. The other thing that I will note here is there's a fun little thing in this. We get a link between 2 names that we have heard before. In mentions of the Forsaken, we have before heard tell of Ishamael. And we have also, way back in the Dragonmount prologue, heard the name Betrayer of Hope. If you'll recall, Lews Therin was being taunted by a man who called himself Betrayer of Hope. So we at least now have a little bit more context, at least to some degree, of who or what the Forsaken are. One of them, Ishamael, is someone who was there with Lews Therin on the day that he destroyed his kingdom in his madness. So this at least gives us a little more detail, something that's really easy to miss, but it's a name we have heard before in this book. I don't know whether you have any reaction to that at all, or if we should just dive on, but I wanted to make sure there was at least that little nugget people might get out of the podcast.
Helpful, certainly. Obviously, you say Ishamael, and I think of Moby Dick, and we've been talking so much about the resonance between Herman Melville's mythology and this kind of weaving idea. Of course, we have a friend who would be shouting at me, "Hey, you heathen, Ishmael's in the Bible too," which is also true, of course, which I believe he's Abraham's son, and he's a kind of prophet. And by that, I mean I just Googled it, and that's what they told me, and I'm pretending I knew it off the top of my head. So the theme of a prophet there at the breaking of the world, and here that also kind of resonates as well, because we're talking a lot about forecasts and looking forward. So great. Interesting. It very much sounds like the Nazgul to me as well, but we've kind of left Tolkien world behind, so I'm not banking on that one. Tyler, could you please take us into the next chapter with your
Ab-
summary?
Absolutely, I can. And I love that you mentioned that we are leaving Tolkien world because that is how this book feels now that we are out of the dredge of the middle section of the book. Yay. Chapter 43, Decisions and Apparitions. So this chapter begins with Loyal being asked to explain what he meant when he said if they went in the ways, they would be killed. He says he kind of needs to give the history of the ways, and Moraine gives him kind of permission to tell the full story, although briefly, he is not brief. First, he describes how during the breaking of the world, the Ogier gave sanctuary to the male Aes Sedai who were going mad. While they were in the steading, they weren't able to touch the true source. That meant they weren't going mad, but eventually all of them felt the loss of the ability to touch the power, and so as a result, they all left hoping that the taint would be gone. It never was. They all went mad. At this point, Moraine actually jumps in, and we get a new piece of information about her. She says that she is of the blue Aja, and so as a result, she doesn't blame the Ogier for doing anything wrong during the sanctuary. She believes that they actually preserved the world by not letting as many men go mad simultaneously. After this, Loyal then explains that as a gift for protecting the male Aes Sedai, they made what were known as the Ways, which were basically, I'm going to go sci-fi on this, but they're seemingly like extra dimensional paths from one place to another, right? They are a way of making you get from one place to another what should have been 1,000-day journey instead is a day or two. And the real benefit of the Ways during the breaking is that even when the world was being ripped apart and things were moving or becoming mountains out of nowhere, the Ways didn't change. And so the routes would stay the same even as the world was altering. This seemed magical. It worked very well. They were able to grow new ways all around the world. Unfortunately, about 1,000 years ago, the ways started to become dark and people started to become lost and vanish. Eventually, the only people who came out of the ways were raving and mad. And in particular, we're talking about what was known as the Black Wind or Machen Shin. And it is now basically against all rules to go into the ways because it is assumed that if you enter, you will be killed by Machen Shin. At this point, we basically get a conversation where Moraine says, yeah, but we gotta go anyway. It's the only option. We need to save the eye of the world. And then interestingly, and I think necessary for the hero's journey, she gives all of the people the opportunity to either opt in or opt out. They all choose to opt in, and then they plan for much of the night. We get a few interesting scenes between Rand and Perrin, Rand and Egwene. Even Master Gil enters the action a little bit. We get kind of a few little side quests, and then we dream. And Rand is once again in Baal Zaman's room. He says it's almost the same as before. He tries to deny it, but he can't leave the dream. The only thing that is different is there is now a table with 3 small figurines, clearly representing him, Mat, and Perrin. He goes through all of the like I'll live again spiel, yada yada yada. Baal Zaman is doing Baal Zaman. We do get a couple of new kind of allusions from Baal Zaman. In particular, he now claims that there are hundreds of Aes Sedai who serve him, what he calls the Black Aja. And then Rand denies him one more time, wakes up, finds that Mat had the same dream. Mat was, of course, a rube and picked up the statue of himself, revealing himself. At this point, Rand realizes that his hand has been punctured where he was pierced by a thorn in the dream. He shows Moraine and she says, we're getting out of here right now. And that is where we leave the chapter. So I suspect this is going to be the shorter of our 2 chapters of discussion because plot kills conversation sometimes. But what was your takeaway from this chapter that I feel like kind of has a few really different parts, but gives us a lot of things in each of those sections?
Yeah, and I'm tempted to just read my notes almost as a rundown of that, but I'll avoid that temptation. So taking them, I don't even know if I could say roughly in chronological order, but the ways seemed pretty clear to me pretty quick.
Yeah.
It did feel like a whole suddenly a new kind of magic, right? We haven't had this kind of magic here exactly in this form already.
Yeah.
And so, as we continue to add pieces, this felt like kind of a big leap. And one of my criticisms of like late Harry Potter is they're like, just kidding, you can't make food. And then they make 28
Yeah.
chapters of like them starving because they can't make food. And it's like, wait, where did this rule come from? Like, wasn't there magic food? Oh, you have an explanation. So it felt a little like, okay, we're gonna add this after the fact.
Yeah.
It's not quite as convenient as I just made it sound because it's not a like get out of jail free card. But I will say, as the person here who does not read any fantasy, there's a new fantasy. It's planned as a trilogy coming out by Marlon James. The first one was Black Leopard, Red Wolf. And there is a very similar device there where it's doors and pathways, and you can just pass between those doors. And when you enter a door, you don't necessarily know which door you're going to come out of, even if you've been the opposite direction. It's not like a one way. So it felt like that. And obviously, as to be very clear, he would have been taking it from this. But that set of books is kind of been hyped up as the African Game of Thrones. It kind of takes all of African mythology and tries to do to African mythology what classic fantasy does with European mythology. And so it's really interesting. It's a great set of books. So far there's two. They're really good. We'll see how the third sticks the landing. But I was just struck that there was this similar thing, even though maybe I went towards wormholes like you did, because it just seemed like that was the kind of relationship we were talking about.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really interesting to note as we're talking about kind of this like big step up in power, or it feels a little bit out of place, is I would compare the way that we are thinking about the ways to kind of the way Moraine was talking when she described Whitebridge to Nynaeve, right? It's almost like lost technology to some degree. It seems like the things that were done in the old days when Whitebridge was made or the ways were made are, just on an order of magnitude beyond what it seems like Moraine has been doing and what we've observed. And so it's not entirely clear at this point how much of that is Moraine maybe not being as powerful as the people who did those things, or knowledge being lost because we've seen so much change since the breaking of the world, or there's lots of possible explanations that fit into what we've seen here. But it's clear that even if the ways are like well beyond anything else we've seen, that might be part of kind of like the deep time story as much as it is about like a step up in power or a kind of convenient way of getting places. Although I will say my big criticism of some of the early Wheel of Time books is just the way that it seems like they find a new way to travel all the time they need to. Broadly speaking, I think the ways are an interesting idea. I'm curious what you thought about kind of the connection between the Aes Sedai going mad, something we haven't gotten much of a description of, and then obviously kind of the fall of the ways that we hear kind of in the next big chunk of what Loyal is giving us in terms of lore. Because we have kind of this insight into what the breaking looked like in a way that we haven't seen at any point so far in the story.
So if I understand it correctly, we knew that as men gain their Aes Sedai powers, they slowly go mad. But here we specifically have the gathering of a group of them kind of in a what should be a sanctuary. And then that becomes its own problem, though not exactly the breaking of the world. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, so basically the idea here is that Luz Theron, we saw in the prologue, is kind of the first Aes Sedai we've seen who goes mad, and so he, kills his family, he destroys everything. What we are now learning is that during what we now know as the breaking of the world, all of the men who could channel went through something similar. And so in the way that Luz Theron was able to draw out lava and create a giant volcano that marred the world, it seems like thousands of men who could channel were doing similar things all over the world. And so this is where we get references in this chapter to like mountains being created or valleys being drawn or oceans moving, right? It's these men who are going insane and destroying the world along with them. While that is happening, some of the men who knew they were going to go mad were taken inside of the steading where channeling is impossible. And so because they were no longer touching the tainted one power, they were no longer going mad.
I see.
And so the idea is that after, or during the breaking of the world, some of these men who at the time were not mad but knew they were going to created the ways. And then it's now become clear, well, for over 2,000 years it seemed like it worked perfectly fine. About 1,000 years ago, in present day terms, something about that taint on the one power seems to have seeped its way into the ways in some way, right? They were made by men who were tainted, and so now it seems like the ways have become tainted. Does that kind of clarify what you were looking for? Now I'm asking the
Yeah.
question I always ask my students. Sorry.
No, that does. That's helpful as well. So, um, and then, the idea that this was a gift that is a fallen gift, that just, again, you referenced deep time like 3 times here. And I think that's just where my mind goes, right?
Yeah.
Again, Lord of the Rings with its ancient ruins of Numenor laying around. It's the same thing here. Okay, taking some notes that really don't need any explanation, probably in order. Parents still wolfy, awkward teen sweetness.
Yep.
And then my favorite moment from the dream, how it always starts. So, it seemed to me like Moraine was charging them with deny him his power, and you'll
Yeah.
be all set. And then Baalzamon is the he I mean here, just kind of laughs it all. It's like, yeah, this is how it always starts. And it's you've been here before, you'll be here again. He still understands that pattern way better than our boys do. So to me, that was really striking. It was, oh yes, I know this. I know this step. We're here now, right? It's not,
Yeah.
wow, you denied me, I'm stymied. And so that naturally keeps my mind on who's more powerful in this, the Dark One, Moraine. Seems clear the answer is the Dark One, but Moraine is trying her best. So
Yeah, and I think that this is especially interesting when we put it in the context of what we heard in the previous chapter with Moraine saying just being close to her, she expected to be able to, if not stop the dreams entirely, at least reduce their frequency. And yet they have the dream immediately after she arrives, right? So it's
yeah.
clear that her protection is not doing what she expects. It's clear that her advice about denying Baalzamon isn't working the way she expects it to. I think this, and especially at the end of the chapter, they describe what's happening, and her immediate response is time is running short. I think this is Moraine's plans not having caught up to just how far this has progressed to some degree, right? She's giving them advice that would have worked on page 100, but we are well past that, as all of you who have been reading along with us know very well. So I think that this dream, if this is kind of where we're going with it, is especially interesting because we've had Baalzamon a few times kind of hint you're not going to be quite as safe as you thought in Tar Valon, but this is the first time we've actually heard him say the phrase the Black Aja, right? We are now dealing with a specific organization that Baalzamon is claiming is embedded within Tar Valon in the shadows. So I'm curious whether that is a revelation that jumped out to you at all, or if there was anything else in his kind of like I am all powerful speech that you especially thought was kind of, something that was interesting or that was telling you where the story is going, if that makes sense.
Well, so it was a good reminder to me that the Aes Sedai should not be viewed as a whole, that they are an organization. And we had the reminder last week with
Elida.
That, and we constantly have characters warning us. And so now we're learning the factions within the factions. So we already knew about the Red Aja, right?
Yeah.
And then now we know Moraine was Blue Aja, which means she felt a certain way about the protection of the men who were going mad.
Yep.
And now we also have the Black Aja.
Correct.
That's it? That's all we know?
That is all we know at this point, I believe.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the old song, No More Aja. But I think that's pretty fascinating. It made me recall, and this is probably not right, but there was a time when the boys saw a shadow move in the farm chapters, like the village chapters, right? They were outside an inn and saw a shadow moving and manipulating things. And that's when they like jumped on board a hay wagon and got out of Dodge really fast in that particular case. So I don't think I'm smart enough to say that was for sure a Black Aja, but when we're talking about shadows moving and hiding in the shadows, it seemed like, oh, that we see one of those before?
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting here is the idea that every time Rand is interacting in these dreams, we get something new. And so this is either, I think, a sign that Baal-Zaman is kind of trying to turn the screws. We see that he is really trying to manipulate Rand into behaving in a particular way. He wants him giving up whatever information he can, yada, yada. But I think there's also something really interesting going on here, just in the sense that Baal-Zaman seems to have almost unlimited options for how to unnerve Rand, right? This is Revelation like 8 in these dreams. And so the fact that he's able to continue ratcheting that up in the face of, as you're saying, just having so much already to hold over Rand, I think is, it's intimidating and it's scary. And that's what these dream sequences are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to make you feel like this is an all-powerful character, and it's horrifying. That's my notes. I don't know about you.
I think my last non sequitur note, well, we skipped Black Aja exist, and then they will run. Like boom.
Yeah.
And again, that's the top of the hill. The roller coaster's really off the cart. Well, not off the rails. That's not how roller coasters work, but it's just flying down the rails. And I think it's really exciting to think about where this is going. It seems, I did some wild speculating last week. It seems like they're going to be able to slip out, especially now that we have the ways. But I think there will be a cost, right? And I don't know yet what that cost is. This book seems very slow to kill off characters. Even Tom does not feel gone. So I suspect it will be a different kind of cost, a capture or a real setback in the cause of the light. So I am also good, which means I'm going to note that we are just trundling right along with another 2 chapters for next week. So we're on to 44 and 45 next week. That would be The Dark Along the Ways and What Follows in Shadow. Which takes us up past page 700 in my book and to a map, which probably won't be on for 2 episodes. But when Tylor told me what chapters we were covering, I said, oh, there's a map up here. So looking forward to discussing that as the time goes forward. And I really did describe this. I was on my Andor podcast, which is on the Rebel Base Card feed, just a little side plug. And we were talking about it. And I said, oh, no, it's really designed to be evergreen. And we're hoping that basically anytime somebody picks up the Wheel of Time in the future or picks it up again, we can be their company. So we hope we've been your company as we're kind of aiming towards the end of this book. And I'll be quiet and let Tylor close us out.
I'm going to close us out is apparently what is happening. So this is now getting towards the part of the book that I think, Greg, you said some of your relatives had described to you, right? This is a book that it takes a little while to grab you, but once it does, you are grabbed, right? And so we are really getting towards the part of the book that I get excited to read. We talked earlier today about, sometimes the 4th time I've kind of caught all the clues. This is the fun part. And so I think if this is something you're really enjoying, the only thing I would say beyond our usual sign off is we're now getting towards the end of book 1. We're about to start book 2. This is an awesome time to start telling your friends about this wonderful book. Tell them to read it. They can catch up with us. They'll have an entire book's worth of podcasts available. They'll probably have a second one by the time they finish. And we are really having just a great time doing this. We're planning to continue doing so. So help us find some more people to join the book club. I think it'll be really exciting. And we'll get an opportunity to go through the ways, a new level of magic, as Greg described it, next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.